My future father-in-law looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Love doesn't pay mortgage payments." I quietly returned the engagement ring and walked out before anyone could stop me. Less than a year later, he opened a financial magazine during breakfast and realized the young man he had mocked was smiling back at him from the cover. The night everything changed, my future father-in-law didn't raise his voice once. Richard Whitfield set his wine glass down on the linen tablecloth, folded his hands the way he probably did in boardrooms right before he fired someone, and looked at me like I was a number that didn't add up. "Love doesn't pay mortgage payments, Ben." Claire's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her mother suddenly found something fascinating in her napkin. Nobody said anything for what felt like a full minute, which in a dining room that quiet might as well have been an hour. I remember the exact things I noticed instead of responding right away. The candle on the table had burned unevenly, wax pooling thicker on one side. The chandelier above us threw a soft yellow light that made everyone look a little older than they were. Claire's hand, resting near her water glass, wasn't reaching for mine. That last part was the one that actually hurt. I didn't argue with him. I didn't ask what he meant, because I already knew. 6 years at a boutique financial advisory firm in Charlotte, a salary that wouldn't impress anyone at that table, and a girlfriend, fiancé, technically, for 11 days, whose father built half the office parks off for 85. I reached into my jacket pocket, took out the small velvet box I'd carried around for 2 weeks trying to find the right moment to give it back its meaning, and set it on the table between the bread basket and his wine glass. "You're right," I said. "It doesn't." Then I stood up, pushed my chair in. I don't know why that detail matters to me, but it does, the pushing in of the chair, and walked out through the Whitfields' front hallway, past the family photos, past the console table with the bowl of car keys, into November air that smelled like somebody's fireplace 3 houses down. Claire caught up to me in the driveway. She didn't say anything about her father. She said, "Ben, can we just talk about this tomorrow?" Which told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in that house, and where I'd apparently been standing the entire time. I got in my car. I drove home to the apartment we hadn't quite finished moving into together, and I sat in the driver's seat for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I want to be honest about something. This isn't a story about revenge. I didn't spend the next year plotting how to make Richard Whitfield eat his words. I spent most of it just trying to remember who I was before I started shrinking myself to fit inside somebody else's idea of what I should be worth. But if you want to understand how I ended up in that driveway, you have to go back to the spring before, back when none of this seemed possible, back when Claire Whitfield was just a woman I couldn't stop thinking about after one conversation at a mutual friend's birthday party. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. We met in April, at a rooftop bar in South End that a friend of mine from college had rented out for her 30th. I didn't know many people there. I was leaning against the railing, half watching the city, when a woman in a green dress asked if I'd seen where the bartender had disappeared to. "I think he's regretting his life choices somewhere behind that curtain," I said. She laughed. Actually laughed, not the polite kind, and said, "Same." And that was it. We talked for 2 hours. She worked in urban planning for the city, which surprised me, because I'd assumed anyone with a name like Whitfield in this town did real estate or law. She told me later her father had assumed the same thing, and hated that she hadn't. Claire was sharp in a way that didn't need volume to prove it. She noticed things. She'd point out a building downtown and tell me what used to be there before the developers got to it, and there'd be something almost mournful in the way she said it, like she was speaking for a version of the city nobody else remembered. We started seeing each other twice a week, then most days. She had a laugh that came out sideways, like it surprised her every time. I had a habit of leaving my phone face down on the table, and she noticed that too, said it made her trust me before she had a reason to. By July, we were unofficially living together, her apartment, then eventually both of ours, deciding which one to keep. By September, I'd met her mother, Diane, who was warm in a nervous kind of way, always refilling something before you'd noticed it was empty. I didn't meet Richard until October. Claire had put it off longer than felt normal, and I remember asking her about it once, half joking, and her face doing something complicated before she said, "He's just particular about people." I found out what particular meant on a Sunday afternoon at his house in Myers Park, a house that looked like it had been built specifically to make visitors feel slightly underdressed. Richard shook my hand like he was testing the grip strength of a mid-tier employee. He asked what I did, and when I told him, financial advisory, Mostly small business retirement planning, some individual portfolio work. He nodded in a way that wasn't quite a nod. More like a note being taken. Small firm, he said. Not a question. 14 people, I said. We do good work. I'm sure you do. That was the whole exchange, but somehow it took up the rest of the afternoon. Every time he spoke to me after that, there was this undertone, like he was translating my job title into a number in his head and coming up short. Claire caught me in the kitchen afterward, pouring me a glass of water I hadn't asked for, which was her way of checking on me without asking directly if I was okay. He's like that with everyone at first, she said. Is he? I said, and she heard the flatness in it and didn't push. Driving home that night, she reached over and put her hand on my leg, not saying anything, and I remember thinking that was enough. I remember thinking I didn't need her father's approval, I just needed hers, and at the time, I believed I had it completely. He proposed the idea before I did, in a way. Richard, I mean, not to marry Claire, obviously, but to fold me into his world. In November, 3 weeks before the dinner that ended everything, he invited me to lunch. Just the two of us, at a steakhouse downtown with white tablecloths and a wine list that cost more than my car payment. I've got an opening, he said, halfway through the meal, like it was an afterthought. Investment side. Client relations. You'd be good at it. You clearly know how to talk to people. I asked what it paid. He told me. It was more than double what I made. I appreciate that, I said. But I like where I am. Something shifted in his face, small, almost imperceptible if you weren't watching for it. You proposed to my daughter, he said. You understand there's a certain standard that comes with that. I understand there's a certain standard I hold myself to, I said. It's not the same thing. He smiled at that, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile of a man filing something away for later use. I told Claire about the lunch that night. She got quiet, the way she did when she was caught between two people she loved and didn't want to pick a side. He means well, she said, which I noticed wasn't the same as saying he was right. Does he? I said again. Same flat tone as before. She didn't have an answer this time either. The wedding planning started in earnest that same week, and with it came a different kind of pressure. Not loud, never loud, just constant. Richard wanted to pay for the venue, which sounded generous until you heard the conditions attached. His choice of caterer, his guest list additions, his opinion on where we should eventually live, which turned out to be a townhouse 15 minutes from his own house. It's not that he wants control, Claire said one night, more to convince herself than me. He just doesn't know how to show love any other way. I think some people do know, I said. I just don't think he's tried. We didn't fight about it. That's the part people don't expect. I never once raised my voice at Claire during any of this. We were gentle with each other the entire time. Careful, like two people carrying something breakable between them and terrified of the moment one of us would trip. But underneath the gentleness, something was shifting. I started noticing how often Claire deferred a decision until she'd run it past her father. I started noticing how she'd rehearse what she was going to tell him before certain conversations, like she was preparing testimony. And I started noticing how much smaller I felt every time I left that house in Myers Park. 3 days before the dinner where I gave back the ring, Richard called me directly. Not through Claire. Me. I want to help you, he said, and I actually believed for half a second he meant it kindly. I could get you in front of some real clients. People with real portfolios. This job you have now, it's fine for practice. But you're about to be my son-in-law. People are going to ask what you do. I know what I do, I said. I help people who don't have a lot figure out how to have a little more. I think that matters. It's charity work with a paycheck, he said, and laughed, like it was a joke between friends. I didn't laugh. Think about it, he said, before hanging up. Sunday dinner. We'll talk more. I told Claire about the call. I watched her face do the thing it always did, caught, torn, quiet, and for the first time, I asked her directly, do you think he's wrong? She hesitated, just for a second. But I noticed it, the way I noticed everything by then, and that hesitation sat in my chest for 3 days like a stone I couldn't put down. Sunday came. We sat at that table. He said the line about mortgage payments like he was reading a verdict he'd already written days ago, and I found out, in the silence after it, exactly how long that hesitation of hers had actually been. I moved out of our shared apartment 9 days later. Claire didn't fight to stop me. Not really. She cried. She said she was sorry. She said her father had no right, but she never once said the one thing I kept waiting for, which was that she'd stand between us the next time he tried something like that. I think some part of her knew she couldn't promise that honestly, and I respected the fact that she didn't lie to make me stay. I found a one-bedroom off Central Avenue, the kind of place with a window unit instead of central air and a landlord who took 4 days to fix anything. I remember the first night there, sitting on a mattress on the floor because the bed frame hadn't arrived yet, eating gas station sushi because I hadn't unpacked a single pan. I didn't cry that night. I want to be honest about that too, because it would make a better story if I had. I just sat there, feeling strangely light, the way you feel after putting down a bag you didn't realize was that heavy. The next few weeks were quieter than I expected grief to be. I went to work. I came home. I microwaved things. I texted my sister, Amanda, who lived in Raleigh, more than I had in years, mostly one-word updates that she somehow always knew how to read correctly. Fine. Rough day. Better today. I didn't talk to Richard again. I saw Claire twice. Once to split the lease paperwork, once by accident at a coffee shop, where we talked for 10 awkward minutes about nothing important and then went our separate ways. She looked tired. I probably did too. What I didn't expect was how much space that emptiness would leave for something else to grow. It started small, almost by accident. At work, I'd built a habit over the years of writing up little breakdowns for clients. Plain language explanations of what was happening with interest rates, what a recession actually meant for somebody making $60,000 a year, why their 401k dropped, and whether they should panic. My boss liked them. Clients liked them more. One night in December, restless in that apartment with the window unit rattling, I opened my laptop and wrote one of those breakdowns as a blog post instead. Nothing fancy. I called it Money, Plainly, which I later realized wasn't the most original name in the world, but it was honest, and honesty was about the only thing I had energy for. I posted it to a personal finance forum. 40 people read it the first day. 12 commented, most of them asking follow-up questions I actually enjoyed answering. I kept doing it. 2, 3 times a week, whenever I had something worth saying. By January, I had a newsletter with maybe 200 subscribers, mostly people who'd found me through that forum. It wasn't income. It wasn't anything, really, except something that was entirely mine. My sister called it my sad apartment hobby the first time I mentioned it, but she said it gently, and a week later she asked me to send her the sign-up link, which told me she meant it as a joke and not a judgment. I didn't tell Claire about it. I didn't tell anyone at work either. It felt like something I needed to keep separate from every part of my life that had recently collapsed. By February, the newsletter had grown to around 1,100 subscribers, which felt enormous to me at the time, even though I'd later learn it was barely a start. I got my first piece of real feedback that mattered, an email from a woman in Ohio who said one of my posts, about how to talk to an aging parent about their finances without it turning into a fight, had helped her have that exact conversation with her mother. I read that email 4 times. I don't think anything at my actual job had ever made me feel that specific kind of useful. Then, in March, everything nearly fell apart. A subscriber, a man who ran a small landscaping business, took one of my posts about diversifying beyond a single retirement account and misapplied it badly, moving money in a way I hadn't recommended and losing a chunk of it in a bad month for the market. He wrote me an angry email, CCNG 2 of his friends, accusing me of giving reckless advice to people who trusted me. I panicked. I remember sitting at my kitchen table. I finally had a table by then. Reading that email 3 times, feeling something close to the shame I'd felt at that dinner table in November. I almost took the whole newsletter down that night. I called my sister instead. She listened to the whole thing and then asked one question. Did you actually tell him to do that? I hadn't. I'd been clear, in the original post, that the strategy depended on individual circumstances and that people should talk to an advisor before making moves. He'd skipped that part. I wrote back to him, calmly, without defensiveness, laying out exactly what I'd said versus what he'd done, and offered to walk him through what had actually happened to his money and how he might recover some ground. He didn't apologize, but he stopped emailing his friends about it, and 2 months later he quietly resubscribed. I didn't lose subscribers that week. I gained 40, mostly people who saw how I'd handled it and respected the tone. That was the first time I understood something important, that most of what I was building wasn't really about the money advice at all. It was about how I responded when things went wrong. People trusted that more than they trusted the advice itself. By late spring, I made the decision that scared me more than anything Richard Whitfield had ever said to me. I gave notice at the advisory firm. My boss, a decent man named Frank who'd hired me straight out of college, tried to talk me out of it. You've got a good thing here, he said. Steady. Reliable. I know, I said. That's kind of the problem. I didn't have a plan that would have satisfied Richard Whitfield's version of a plan. I had 11,000 subscribers, a small amount of ad revenue that wouldn't have covered my rent on its own, and a growing sense that if I didn't try this while I had nothing left to lose, I never would. I took on freelance advisory work to cover the gap, one-off consultations, mostly people who'd found me through the newsletter and wanted a real conversation about their specific situation. It was unglamorous work, done over video calls from my kitchen table, but it paid, and slowly, month by month, it paid more. By August, I'd hired someone part-time to help with the newsletter's growing admin side, a college student named Priya who was better at spreadsheets than I'd ever be. By October, money, plainly, had grown into something with actual structure. A paid tier for deeper portfolio breakdowns, a free tier that kept the trust intact, and a small but real team of 3. I moved apartments in November. Nothing extravagant, just a one-bedroom with actual central air, in a building close enough to my old place that the change felt less like an upgrade and more like proof I'd survived the year. I still hadn't spoken to Claire. I still thought about her more than I wanted to admit, usually late at night, usually when the apartment got quiet enough for old habits of missing someone to surface. The call that changed things came in early November, almost exactly a year after that dinner. It was from an editor at a business magazine called Meridian, mid-sized, well-respected in finance circles, the kind of publication people in Richard Whitfield's world actually read over breakfast. She'd found money, plainly, through a mutual contact, read through a year's worth of archives, and wanted to do a feature on what she called the plain language finance movement, writers and advisors who were making financial literacy accessible to people who'd never had access to it before. "We'd like you for the cover," she said, like it was a normal thing to say to someone who'd been eating gas station sushi on a mattress on the floor less than a year earlier. I didn't say anything for a second. "Are you still there?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Sorry. Yes. I'm interested." The shoot happened 2 weeks later, in a studio downtown, a photographer telling me to relax my shoulders about 6 different times because apparently I hold tension there when I'm nervous. The interview took longer than the photos, an hour and a half of questions about why I'd started the newsletter, what I thought was broken about how financial advice usually got delivered, whether I'd always wanted to do this. I told her the truth, mostly. I told her it started as something I needed for myself during a hard year, and it turned into something other people needed too. I didn't mention Richard. I didn't mention Claire. Some things you keep for yourself, even when a stranger is asking good questions. The issue wasn't set to publish until December. I found out later, secondhand, what that Saturday morning looked like at the Whitfield house. Claire told me, weeks after, in a conversation that still felt unfinished even as we were having it. Richard read Meridian every month, apparently had for 15 years, always at breakfast, always with the same cup of black coffee, according to Claire, in the same chair at the same table. She said he had a particular ritual of flipping straight to the market analysis section and ignoring the cover entirely most months, unless something on it caught his eye. That Saturday, something caught his eye. Claire was there, visiting for the weekend, sitting across from him with her own coffee, when she said he went very still. Not dramatic, not a gasp, not a dropped mug, just stillness, the same kind of stillness that had filled that dining room a year earlier, except this time it was his stillness, not mine. "What is it?" Claire asked him. He didn't answer right away. He turned the magazine around so she could see the cover, and there I was. A version of me in a gray sweater I remembered picking out that morning because it was the only clean thing that fit right, standing with my arms crossed the way the photographer had told me made me look approachable but credible. The headline above my photo read, "The Plain Language Revolution, How One Advisor Built Trust Where Wall Street Couldn't." Claire told me she watched her father read the piece twice, silently, all the way through, his jaw doing something she'd never quite seen it do before. Not anger. Something closer to recalculation. He didn't say anything for a long time, she told me. And then he said, "Huh. Just that. Huh." I didn't feel triumphant when she told me that part. I want to be honest about that. I felt something quieter, something closer to relief that had nothing to do with him at all, and everything to do with the fact that I'd built something real without needing his math to add up in my favor. Claire reached out to me herself, 3 days after that breakfast, not to relay a message from her father, but because, in her words, she'd spent the last year thinking about that dinner more than she'd admitted to anyone, including herself. We met at a coffee shop that wasn't the one we'd run into each other at before, neutral ground, She called it, and I understood what she meant. She looked the same and different at once, the way people do after a year apart, like the photograph in your memory needed a small update. I should have said something that night, she said, before I'd even finished ordering. At the table, I've thought about it more times than I want to admit. Why didn't you? I asked. Not angry, just honest. She was quiet for a second, turning her cup slowly on the table. Because some part of me was scared he was right, she said. Not about you specifically. About stability. What it looked like. I grew up watching him build things, and some part of me thought that was the only version of building something that counted. And now I read the article 3 times, she said, and almost laughed, though it came out more like an exhale. You built something he didn't help you build. That's not lost on me. I didn't tell her I forgave her right there in that coffee shop, because I wasn't sure that was true yet, and I didn't want to say something just to make the moment easier. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I told her I was glad she'd reached out. I told her I needed some time before I knew what came next, if anything did. She nodded, like she'd expected that answer, and said, "That's fair." And for the first time in over a year, neither of us needed the conversation to solve everything in one sitting. Richard called me himself in early December, a few weeks after the article came out. I almost didn't pick up. His name still did something to my chest when it showed up on a screen, but I answered. I read the piece. He said, no greeting, which was very on-brand for him. I heard, I said. There was a pause, the kind of pause I imagined cost him something to sit inside of. I was wrong about the job, he said. The specific job. I still think stability matters. I never said it didn't, I said. I just think there's more than one way to build it. Another pause. Would you consider having lunch, he said. Not to offer you anything, just to talk. I told him I'd think about it, and I meant it honestly, not as a polite deflection, but as an actual decision I hadn't made yet. He didn't push. That, more than anything he could have said, told me something had actually shifted in him, even if it was small. I didn't call Claire that night to tell her about it. I sat with it myself for a while first, the way I'd learned to do with most things that year. I did have lunch with Richard, eventually, in January, at a diner instead of a steakhouse, his choice, which surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened that year. We didn't talk about Claire. We mostly talked about the newsletter, about the article, about a client he'd once lost because he'd underestimated how much people actually wanted someone to explain things to them honestly instead of talking down to them. He never apologized outright. Some men aren't built for that particular sentence. But near the end of the meal, as he was signing the check, he said, "You didn't need my help. I should have seen that sooner. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and I let it be enough for that day." Claire and I started seeing each other again slowly, carefully, that spring. No ring, no rushed conversation about the future, just two people relearning whether they still made sense together now that neither of us was performing for anyone else's approval. Some days it felt easy. Some days it didn't, and we let it not be easy without pretending otherwise. I never went to work for Richard Whitfield, and he never asked again. Last month, almost a year to the day since that dinner in Myers Park, I drove past the old apartment with the window unit, the one I'd lived in when I had nothing but a laptop and a stubborn refusal to let a dinner table decide what I was worth. I didn't stop. I just slowed down a little at the light, looked at the building for a second, and kept driving home. To a life I'd built quietly, one plain language email at a time, to people who never once asked what my mortgage payment looked like before they decided I mattered.